The air on the picnic green was thick with the scent of cut grass and sweet tea, the lazy drone of late summer insects punctuated by the cheerful sawing of a fiddle. It was a perfect Virginia afternoon in 1883. A fragile peace settled over the small, isolated community of Blackwater Ridge. Children chased each other around oak trees, their laughter bright and sharp, while their parents spread blankets and unpacked baskets laden with baked hams, potato salads, and buttermilk pies. And then there was the cornbread. Piled high on a communal table, golden brown and glistening with honey butter, it was the contribution of the town's most enigmatic figure. The first bite was taken, then another. A moment of communal enjoyment, a shared taste of sweetness. Then the fiddler's arm faltered. A note went sour, hanging in the humid air. A woman coughed, a dry, racking sound. A man nearby doubled over, his face contorting, a strangled gasp escaping his lips. A child suddenly went rigid, eyes wide with a silent, paralyzing terror. Within minutes, the idyllic green had transformed into a macabre tableau. Laughter was replaced by horrifying screams, the scent of grass overwhelmed by the acrid smell of sickness. Bodies writhed on the checkered blankets, hands clutching at throats and stomachs, faces pale and slick with a cold sweat. The picnic had become a harvest of death, and the town of Blackwater Ridge was about to be erased, all by a single, horrifying act of culinary betrayal. The cornbread, crumbled and forgotten, was already attracting ants. To understand the horror of that day, one must first understand the place. Blackwater Ridge, Virginia in 1883 was not a town of gentle comforts. It was a scar on the face of the Appalachians, a community clinging to the mountainside, shadowed by deep, forbidding forests and haunted by the recent, bloody memory of the war. The Reconstruction era had been cruel here. Poverty was a constant companion, and suspicion was the local currency. The town was isolated, connected to the outside world only by a treacherous dirt track that was often washed out by rain or blocked by snow. This isolation bred a peculiar kind of populace, insular, wary of strangers, and deeply mired in old superstitions. They were people who knew the dark folklore of the mountains, who whispered stories of haints and curses, and who believed that the woods held secrets best left undisturbed. The very air in Blackwater Ridge felt heavy, charged with unspoken grievances and lingering sorrows. It was a place where a grudge could fester for generations, where the line between civilization and savagery was perilously thin. The town itself was a collection of rough-hewn cabins and a single, stark white church, its steeple seeming to pierce the sky in a desperate plea for salvation. But salvation was in short supply in 1883. There was only the grind of survival, the oppressive silence of the forest, and the disturbing feeling that the entire ridge was balanced on the edge of a horrifying abyss. It was a tinderbox of repressed animosity, waiting for a single, forbidden spark. The spark, as it would turn out, was a person. Her name was Eliza Blackwood, known to the townsfolk simply as the Widow. She lived in a decaying cabin set back from the main track, perched precariously on the ridge that gave the town its name, overlooking the valley like a silent, brooding sentinel. Eliza was a specter in her own right. She was a woman seemingly untouched by time, though the town elders guessed she was no older than 40. She was tall and gaunt, dressed always in the same faded black mourning dress, her dark hair pulled back so tightly it accentuated the sharp, bird-like features of her face. Her eyes were the most disturbing part, dark, depthless, and utterly unreadable. She rarely spoke, and when she did, her voice was a dry rasp, like dead leaves skittering across a floorboard. The children of Blackwater Ridge simultaneously feared and were fascinated by her, daring each other to run past her property line, only to scatter in terror if her curtain so much as twitched. The adults afforded her a wide berth. She was the town pariah, the subject of macabre rumors, the scapegoat for every misfortune. When crops failed, it was Eliza's evil eye. When livestock sickened, it was the widow Blackwood's curse. She was, in every sense, an outcast, existing in the margins of a community that had already defined her as something other, something forbidden. Her isolation was absolute, a wall of silence and suspicion she seemed to cultivate with the same care that she tended the strange, pungent herbs in her overgrown garden. Eliza had not always been the widow. She had arrived in Blackwater Ridge years earlier as the young bride of Silas Blackwood, a man of considerable influence and fearsome reputation. Silas was a land baron, a man who had profited handsomely from the war's aftermath, buying up defaulted properties and holding the town's debt in his iron fist. He was not a kind man. He was known for his violent temper, his heavy drinking, and the cruel, casual way he treated his horses, his workers, and his new wife. The town had watched Silas's casual brutality, and they had watched Eliza endure it. They saw the bruises she tried to hide, the way she flinched when he spoke. But Silas held their deeds and their futures, so the town remained silent. Their silence was a poison of its own. Then 2 years ago, Silas Blackwood had vanished. A search party was formed, more out of obligation than concern. They found him 3 days later at the bottom of a deep, dry well on the edge of his own property. The official ruling from the county sheriff, a man who owed Silas a significant sum, was a tragic accident, a drunken stumble in the dark. But the people of Blackwater Ridge whispered a different story. They whispered about the look of calm, almost serene detachment on Eliza's face at the funeral. They whispered about how she had been the last person to see him alive. They whispered the word murder. No one could prove it. The case was closed, filed away as a cold, unfortunate incident. But in the court of public opinion, Eliza was already condemned. She was the woman who had gotten away with it, and the town never let her forget. The Founders' Day picnic was meant to be a balm on the town's festering wounds. It was an annual tradition, a day to celebrate the hard-won survival of Blackwater Ridge. This year, Reverend Miller, a stern, God-fearing man who saw sin in every shadow, had insisted upon it. He preached a sermon on unity, on forgiveness, on letting the past be buried with the dead. He spoke of mending fences and healing the community's fractured spirit. It was in this atmosphere of forced reconciliation that the unthinkable happened. Eliza Blackwood, who had not set foot in the town proper since her husband's funeral, appeared at the Sunday service. She stood in the back, a stark silhouette against the bright morning light. When the service ended, she approached Reverend Miller. Her voice, though quiet, cut through the murmurs of the congregation. She announced that, as a gesture of goodwill, she wished to attend the picnic, and furthermore, she wished to contribute. She would bake her specialty, the one thing her cruel husband had ever praised, her sweet honey cornbread. The town was paralyzed by the offer. It was a horrifying breach of their unspoken social contract. To refuse would be a public and direct accusation, a confirmation of their suspicions. To accept felt like a different kind of danger. Reverend Miller, caught in the trap of his own sermon, forced a thin smile and accepted her offer, proclaiming it a sign of God's grace. The congregation nodded, but their eyes were cold. A feeling of intense, creeping dread began to settle over Blackwater Ridge. The picnic was still a week away, but the curse already felt like it had begun. The week leading up to the picnic was one of the most suffocating the town had ever endured. The weather turned, the bright summer sky replaced by a low, oppressive gray canopy that threatened rain but never delivered. The air grew still and heavy, amplifying every sound: the buzz of a fly, the creak of a floorboard, the distant, mournful call of a whippoorwill. It felt, as one town elder later recalled, like the entire ridge was holding its breath. All eyes were on the cabin on the hill. Smoke was seen rising from Eliza Blackwood's chimney at odd hours, thick and dark, carrying a strange, acrid smell that mingled with the sweetness of baking corn. The townsfolk tried to go about their business, but the tension was a physical presence. Neighbors argued over trivialities, children woke from horrifying nightmares, and Reverend Miller's sermons grew increasingly frenetic, filled with dark portents and warnings of a serpent in the garden. He never mentioned Eliza by name, but everyone knew who the serpent was. The women of the town, in particular, were consumed by a mixture of fear and macabre curiosity. They were the ones who had whispered the loudest about Silas's death, who had ostracized Eliza most completely. Now they were being asked to eat her food to break bread, or rather cornbread, with a woman they believed to be a killer. It was a forbidden, terrifying prospect. They baked their own offerings, pies and cakes and loaves, as if warding off an evil spirit with their own domestic magic, their knuckles white as they kneaded the dough, praying for protection from the coming feast. Inside the dark, stifling cabin, Eliza Blackwood moved with a chilling, methodical grace. The interior was sparse, almost unnaturally clean, save for the massive, cold hearth and the bundles of dried herbs hanging from the rafters, herbs the townsfolk couldn't identify. She worked by the light of a single flickering candle, though it was the middle of the day. She laid out her ingredients with the precision of an apothecary: bowls of golden cornmeal, jugs of fresh buttermilk, jars of dark, viscous honey. It was a scene of perfect rustic domesticity. And then she unlocked the small, iron-bound box she kept beneath her cot. This was Silas's box, one he had forbidden her to touch. Inside, nestled amongst his ledgers and deeds, was a small, unassuming paper packet. The label, printed in stark black letters, read, "Arsenic for vermin." She had found it years ago during one of his drunken rages. He had threatened her with it, laughed at her terror, said it was how he kept the rats in line. Now she held the packet with a steady hand. There was no hesitation, no flicker of doubt in her dark eyes. She was not a woman seized by a fit of passion. This was something else. This was a ritual. This was an accounting. She carefully measured a quantity of the fine white powder, its crystalline structure glittering in the candlelight, and sifted it directly into the dry ingredients. She mixed the batter slowly, her movements rhythmic, hypnotic. The only sound was the scrape of the wooden spoon against the earthenware bowl, a sound like a spade digging into hard, dry earth. Reverend Miller could not sleep. The night before the picnic, he was found pacing the aisle of his empty church, his Bible clutched in his hand. He was a man tormented. He felt he had made a terrible, fatal error. His call for unity had, he feared, invited the devil to their table. He had seen the way Eliza Blackwood looked at him when she made her offer, not with humility, but with a cold, triumphant glint. He had tried to warn his congregation, but his words had been veiled in Scripture, and his flock, desperate for a day of celebration, had chosen to interpret his sermon as a call for bravery, not caution. Now it was too late. To cancel the picnic would be to admit his terror, to give power to the very darkness he claimed to fight. He prayed for a sign, a way out. He even considered visiting Eliza's cabin himself to confront her, to forbid her from coming. But the thought of facing her alone on her own territory filled him with a profound, almost supernatural dread. He was, at his core, a man who feared the unknown more than he trusted his faith. His wife found him asleep in the front pew at dawn, his face etched with anxiety. "It's a beautiful day, husband," she told him, trying to soothe his spirit. "The Lord has provided." But as Reverend Miller looked out the window at the bright, cloudless sky, he felt a horrifying chill. He was convinced the Lord had provided nothing. He was delivering them into a carefully laid, macabre trap. The morning of the Founders' Day picnic arrived with a deceptive, brilliant clarity. The oppressive humidity had broken, leaving the air crisp and the sky a piercing, benevolent blue. It was the most beautiful day of the year. This perfect weather seemed to mock the town's underlying fear, compelling them forward. To stay home would be to admit cowardice. And so they gathered. Families emerged from their cabins in their Sunday best, carrying their baskets, their faces scrubbed and their expressions carefully neutral. They converged on the town green, a patch of communal land by the creek, and the rituals of the day began. The fiddles struck up a cheerful tune. Blankets were spread. The men gathered to talk crops and politics, the women to gossip and arrange the food. For a few hours, a fragile normality returned. It almost felt good. And then at precisely midday, a shadow fell across the green. The fiddler stopped mid-tune. Every head turned. Eliza Blackwood was walking down the track from her cabin. She was not in her usual faded black. She was wearing a simple, clean dress of dark blue, her hair neatly pinned. In her hands she carried the largest, most beautiful basket of cornbread anyone had ever seen. It was baked to a perfect golden brown, sectioned into neat squares and drizzled with a glistening layer of honey. She placed the basket on the central table, smiled, a thin, brittle expression that did not reach her eyes, and said, "God bless this town." The silence that followed her words was absolute. It was a vacuum pulling all the air and life from the picnic. The townsfolk stared at the cornbread, then at Eliza. She had done it. She had called their bluff. Now the choice was upon them. To eat was to trust her. To refuse was to accuse her. Reverend Miller, his face pale as ash, knew he had to act. He was the town's spiritual leader. He stepped forward, his movement stiff. "We thank you for your Christian charity, Widow Blackwood," he intoned, his voice trembling slightly. He picked up a square of the cornbread. He held it up as if it were a communion wafer. "Let us break bread together as a community reborn." He took a bite. He chewed slowly, deliberately, his eyes locked on Eliza. He swallowed. He nodded, forcing another thin smile. "It is delicious." That was all it took. The spell was broken. If Th. Irreverend could eat it, it must be safe. A tentative ripple of movement started. One by one, men, women, and children stepped forward. They were hungry, and the cornbread looked and smelled divine. They took pieces back to their blankets. They laughed, the tension easing. They praised its sweetness, its moist texture. Eliza Blackwood stood by the table, watching. She did not eat a piece herself. She just watched, her dark eyes moving from family to family, her expression as serene and still as a death mask. The entire town was eating from her hand. The trap was sprung. The horror did not begin all at once. It was not a sudden, dramatic collapse. It was a slow, insidious creep which made it all the more terrifying. The first sign was the metallic taste. Several people mentioned it but dismissed it as a strange spice Eliza had used or a quirk of the honey. Then came the thirst. A burning, unquenchable thirst that sent people scrambling for the lemonade and water jugs. Within 20 minutes, the thirst was accompanied by a powerful, tightening sensation in the chest, a feeling of fire in the belly. The fiddler was the first to show severe symptoms. He stood up, complaining of dizziness, and his face, which had been ruddy from playing, went a stark, horrifying white. He dropped his fiddle, clutched his stomach, and vomited a violent spray of bile. The music stopped. A woman screamed. Then another. A child who had been laughing moments before began to convulse, his limbs jerking in a grotesque, unnatural dance. The scene descended into pure primal chaos. Panic erupted as people realized what was happening. They were poisoned, all of them. The realization was a wave of collective terror that drowned out all reason. Husbands and wives grabbed for each other. Parents frantically searched for their children, many already lying listless on the blankets. The green became a writhing mass of agony. It was a scene from a disturbing, macabre painting, a Sunday picnic transformed into the depths of hell. Reverend Miller stood frozen, his own body a war zone of pain. His stomach was cramping so violently he could barely stand, but a worse horror paralyzed him. He watched his wife collapse, her hand outstretched to him. He saw his 8-year-old son, Daniel, lying by the creek, his small body shuddering. The bite of cornbread the Reverend had eaten, the one meant to show his faith, was now dissolving in his gut, a sacrament of death. He staggered toward his son, his legs buckling. The air was filled with the most horrifying sounds a person can hear. The retching of the sick, the agonized moans of the dying, and the high-pitched, terrified shrieks of those still strong enough to understand their fate. "The cornbread," a man bellowed, his voice thick with pain. "It's the cornbread." The baskets were kicked over, the remaining golden squares trampled into the mud and sickness. All eyes, wild with pain and rage, scanned the green for the source of their doom. They searched for the dark blue dress, for the pale face and the dead eyes. They searched for the widow. But Eliza Blackwood was gone. She had not run. No one had seen her flee. Amidst the first cries of sickness, she had simply vanished. She had evaporated back into the trees and shadows from which she came, leaving her catastrophic, forbidden offering behind. The terror of the poisoning was instantly compounded by a new, chilling dread. The murderer was loose, and she had disappeared. The few who had been spared, those who had arrived late or who had been too suspicious to eat the cornbread, were now faced with an impossible, horrifying task. The town's only doctor, a man named Elias Thorne, was himself among the victims, clutching his own stomach, his medical bag spilled open beside him. He tried to give orders to call for ipecac or mustard water, but his words were lost in the cacophony of pain. It was a scene of utter societal collapse. The social bonds that held Blackwater Ridge together dissolved in an instant. It became a desperate scramble for survival, a grotesque display of human suffering. People clawed at the ground, their throats raw from screaming. The creek, which had been the site of children's games, now ran murky as the sick crawled to its banks, desperate to drink or cool their burning skin. By the time the sun began to set, casting long, macabre shadows over the green, the screaming had largely subsided. It was replaced by a low, collective moaning and then a spreading, terrible silence. The town of Blackwater Ridge had, in the space of 3 hours, effectively died. Blankets that had been spread for a feast now served as impromptu shrouds. The survivors, perhaps a dozen in total, stared in numb disbelief at the devastation. They were alive, but their world was gone. The town was a graveyard, and the picnic green was its open mass grave. As night fell, a different kind of poison began to infect the survivors, pure, undiluted rage. The shock wore off, replaced by a burning need for vengeance. The men who could still stand, farmers, blacksmiths, trappers, retrieved their rifles and pitchforks. Their grief was too large, too horrifying to process. It could only be channeled into violence. Torches were lit, their flames casting a demonic, flickering light on the pale faces of the dead. The target was clear, the cabin on the ridge. This was no longer a matter for the law, which was dead on the grass with the others. This was a hunt. They formed a posse, a mob driven by a primal, terrifying certainty. They would find the widow Blackwood, and they would deliver the justice their murdered families deserved. The mob, led by a blacksmith named Tom Jennings, whose wife and 2 daughters lay dead, began the ascent. The trek up the ridge was treacherous in the dark, but their fury lit the way. They were a silent, grim procession, the only sounds the crunch of their boots on the gravel path and the occasional chokeback sob. The cabin was dark, a black square against the slightly less black sky. It looked empty, but they knew she was in there. She had to be. There was nowhere else for her to go. The dark woods surrounding them felt alive, as if Eliza's evil had seeped into the very trees, which now watched them with a silent, malevolent judgment. Tom Jennings didn't bother knocking. He kicked the door clean off its rusted hinges. It crashed to the floor, sending up a cloud of dust. "Eliza!" he roared, leveling his rifle into the darkness. The mob surged in behind him, torches held high. The cabin was empty, but what they found was more disturbing than her presence would have been. The single room was cold, the hearth filled with gray ash. A solitary rocking chair, pushed into the corner, began to rock slowly back and forth in the breeze from the broken doorway, a macabre, mocking welcome. The air was heavy with the smell of lye, but underneath it, the faint, sweet scent of honey and cornmeal still lingered. It was a ghost of the day's horror. The cabin was unnaturally tidy, as if its occupant had been preparing for a long journey. The cot was made. The floor was swept. There was no sign of a struggle, no evidence of a hasty retreat. It was a calculated, cold-blooded vanishing. One man checked the small pantry. It was empty save for a single small cloth sack. He opened it. It was full of cornmeal. He dropped it as if it were burning, a strangled curse escaping his lips. They had expected to find a monster in her lair. Instead, they found only the chilling, profound absence of one. The realization hit them all at once. She had planned this. She had planned the baking, the poisoning, and the escape. She was long gone. The hunt began in earnest, but it was a desperate, frantic affair. The surviving men split into groups, plunging into the dense, dark woods that surrounded the ridge. They shouted her name, their voices raw with hatred, but the forest only echoed their calls back at them, mocking their futility. The woods of Blackwater Ridge were a labyrinth, a place of shadow and superstition that even the most experienced hunters avoided after dark. Now they were forced to navigate its forbidden depths, chasing a phantom who knew its secrets far better than they. They found nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, no sign of passage. It was as if Eliza Blackwood had been absorbed by the night itself. The search continued for 2 days, fueled by grief and a refusal to accept her disappearance. But the forest held its secrets tight. The men grew exhausted, their rage turning to a hollow, creeping despair. This complete and total vanishing was, in some ways, more terrifying than finding her. A captured murderer can be punished, understood. A phantom who deals death and disappears becomes something else. She becomes a legend, a curse. The men returned to the valley, defeated, to the horrifying, necessary work of burying their dead. They dug a mass grave on the edge of the picnic green, a long, deep scar in the earth, and interred their families without coffins, without proper rites. Reverend Miller, one of the few who had eaten the bread and survived, his body racked but his life spared, could only stand and weep, his faith shattered. In the aftermath, the county sheriff finally arrived, a grim-faced man from the next town over. He walked the picnic green, his boots stepping around the dark stains on the grass, and he officially declared the site a mass murder. He took statements from the survivors, their voices hollow, their eyes vacant. He, too, led a search of Eliza's cabin, and in his methodical, official sweep, he found what the grieving mob had missed. Tucked beneath a loose floorboard near the cold hearth was a small, leather-bound book. It was not a diary, not in the traditional sense. It was a ledger. On the left side of each page was a name. On the right, a list of grievances. The sheriff read, his blood turning to ice. He found Reverend Miller's name. Grievance, preached of God's love but showed only judgment. He found Tom Jennings's name. Grievance, laughed with Silas as he beat his horse. He found the name of the fiddler. Grievance, sang songs mocking the crazy widow. Page after page, it listed the name of nearly every adult in Blackwater Ridge. Beside each name was a catalog of perceived slights, insults, and acts of cruelty, both real and imagined, stretching back years. It was a meticulous, horrifying record of a mind that had forgotten nothing and forgiven nothing. This was not a random act of madness. It was a cold case of a different sort. It was a systematic, calculated execution of an entire town, delivered by a woman who had appointed herself judge, jury, and, ultimately, executioner. The discovery of the ledger shifted the narrative from a macabre mystery to a disturbing psychological portrait. The sheriff, reading the entries aloud to the survivors, watched as their faces changed from grief to a dawning, sickening comprehension. The grievances were not capital crimes. They were the small, everyday cruelties of an isolated, fearful community. Scornful looks, whispered rumors, doors closed in her face, children encouraged to taunt her. They were the 1,000 tiny cuts that had bled Eliza Blackwood's humanity dry. The town, in its silent, collective rejection of the widow, had created the very monster they feared. They had poisoned her with their suspicion long before she had poisoned them with her arsenic. This realization was a torment worse than the hunt. It implicated them all. The survivors were not just victims. They were, in some small, terrible way, accessories to their own destruction. This forbidden truth settled over the few remaining cabins, a fog of guilt and paranoia. If Eliza had been watching them so closely, cataloging their sins, had she been alone? The remaining neighbors began to look at each other with new suspicion. Who else had been cruel? Who else had a secret grievance? The poison, it seemed, was still working, infecting the very souls of those who had lived. Weeks turned into a month. The town of Blackwater Ridge ceased to exist. The few survivors, unable to live amidst the ghosts and the overwhelming silence, packed their meager belongings and walked away, scattering to distant relatives or disappearing into the larger cities of the plains. The cabins were left to the elements, the doors unlocked, the furniture draped in dust. The picnic green grew wild, the tall grass covering the stains and the sunken earth of the mass grave. Blackwater Ridge became a ghost town, a banned subject, a whispered horror story told in the taverns of neighboring counties. The official file on the massacre remained open, a cold case that no one had any intention of solving. The forest had reclaimed its own. And still, there was no sign of Eliza Blackwood. She had vanished from the face of the earth. The sheriff, pragmatic, assumed she had fled west, or perhaps thrown herself into the deep, churning waters of the Blackwater River. But the few locals who remained in the wider county knew better. A woman like that, they whispered, a woman who could conjure such a horrifying, macabre end, she didn't just run. The mountains had taken her. She had become one of the haunts the town had always feared, a permanent, chilling fixture of the local folklore. The story might have ended there, a chilling but unresolved chapter of dark American history. But the truth, as it so often is in these macabre tales, was far more disturbing than the fiction. If you are finding this descent into the darkness of Blackwater Ridge compelling, and if you want to ensure you don't miss our future explorations of the most forbidden cold cases, take a moment to subscribe to our channel. The discoveries that are made in these dark woods are often the ones that haunt us the longest, and what a pair of hunters found 6 months later, deep in the winter snows, would recontextualize the entire horrifying event. They were not looking for Eliza. They were trapping beaver and had strayed far from the usual paths into a part of the forest known as the Devil's Hollow, a place so dense and dark that the sun never fully penetrated its canopy. The snow was deep, but they found a clearing, and in that clearing they found a scene that would be seared into their minds until the day they died. It was a scene of such grotesque, ritualistic horror that they almost fled, convinced they had stumbled upon something not of this world. It was a tableau of death, frozen in time. There, sitting at the base of an ancient, lightning-struck oak tree, was Eliza Blackwood. She was perfectly preserved by the freezing, dry air, a terrifying ice mummy. She was not in her dark blue dress, nor her widow's black. She was dressed in a rotting, mud-stained wedding gown, the delicate lace torn and blackened by exposure. Her skin was the color of pale blue marble, her eyes wide up and staring, a layer of frost coating her eyelashes. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap. In one hand she clutched a bouquet of withered frozen weeds. In the other she held the empty paper packet that had once contained the arsenic. She had not fled. She had walked deep into the most forbidden part of the woods, donned her wedding dress, and taken her own life, sitting upright as if waiting for a groom who would never arrive. The hunters, hardened men who had seen the horrors of war, were physically sick. The sheer, calculated madness of the scene was overwhelming. This was not the act of a simple fugitive. This was a statement. This was a final, macabre performance. She had chosen her exit, a horrifying mirror to the marriage that had begun her long descent into darkness. The sheriff was recalled, and he brought a wagon to retrieve the frozen body. The task was grim. Eliza's corpse was rigid, her limbs locked in place, her expression of serene, icy detachment permanently fixed. As they worked to move her, the sheriff noticed something else. Clutched tightly in her frozen left hand, concealed by the rotted bouquet, was a small, silver locket. It was tarnished and old. He pried her fingers open, the sound of cracking ice and stiffened sinew echoing in the silent woods. He opened the locket. He was expecting to see a portrait of her late husband, Sela's, or perhaps a secret lover, the hidden motive for her crimes. But the locket contained no portrait. Instead, nestled against the velvet backing, was a tiny, perfect lock of baby-fine blonde hair. The sheriff, a father himself, felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the weather. This changed everything. This single, heartbreaking discovery pointed to a different, deeper, and far more disturbing layer of the tragedy. The ledger had told a story of revenge against a cruel town, but the wedding dress, the ritualistic suicide, and the lock of hair told a story of profound, unimaginable grief. A new, sickening theory began to form in the sheriff's mind. He returned to the abandoned cabin, now half consumed by snowdrifts. He was no longer looking for evidence of a murderer. He was looking for the grave of a victim. With 2 deputies, he began a methodical, horrifying search. They tapped the floorboards, looking for the one he had missed. They found it. Not the one with the ledger, but another beneath the cot, hidden by a patched rug. When they pulled up the boards, the smell that rose from the darkness, even in the cold, confirmed their fears. It was a small, shallow space, barely large enough for a newborn. Inside, they found the skeletal remains of an infant, wrapped in a rotting baptismal cloth. The cold case of Silas Blackwood's death and the cold case of the town's poisoning suddenly snapped into a single, horrifying focus. The town had whispered that Eliza was a murderer, but they had been wrong about who she had killed. Or rather, They had been wrong about her first victim. The question that now hung in the freezing air was the most disturbing of all. Had the child been stillborn, or had it been silenced? The final, horrifying pieces of the puzzle fell into place. The sheriff, piecing together the timeline, surmised that the child had been born during the time of Silas's cruelty. Was it Silas's child? A child he refused to acknowledge, or one he had harmed himself? Or was it perhaps not his at all? A forbidden love that, if discovered, would have meant certain death for both Eliza and the child. The truth was buried with the infant and the widow, but the motive was no longer simple revenge. It was a bottomless, maddening grief. The town hadn't just been cruel to her. Their silence, their refusal to intervene with Silas, had made them complicit in the death of her child. They had watched her suffer, and in doing so had sealed their own fate. The ledger of grievances was not just about scornful looks. It was about their sin of silence while her entire world was destroyed. The poisoning of Blackwater Ridge was not an act of simple murder. It was a monstrous, macabre memorial. She was a mother enacting a scorched-earth policy on the world that had allowed her child to be taken from her. The cornbread was not just a vehicle for poison. It was a darkened version of the bread of life, a shared communion of death that mirrored her own internal, spiritual decay. The sheriff officially closed the case. Murder-suicide, his report stated. He listed Eliza Blackwood as the sole perpetrator and final victim. The town of Blackwater Ridge was declared uninhabitable, its name stricken from the county maps. It became a banned place, a cursed ground. The story itself became a thing of folklore, a terrifying tale to frighten children, but the sharp, horrifying edges of the truth were worn away over time. The macabre details, the ledger, the wedding dress, the infant's grave, were forgotten, deemed too disturbing for polite retelling. The story was simplified, a crazy widow, a poisoned feast. But the truth, as we now know, was infinitely more complex and chilling. It's a story that serves as a horrifying reminder of the darkness that can fester in isolated places, and the explosive, devastating consequences of buried secrets and communal silence. It explores the terrifying idea that the greatest monsters are not born, but are often meticulously, cruelly, and systematically made. The residents of Blackwater Ridge had planted the seeds of their own destruction, and Eliza Blackwood had simply brought in the harvest. Today, nothing remains of Blackwater Ridge but crumbling stone foundations and a few rotting timbers, swallowed by the relentless green of the Virginia forest. Hunters and hikers who stray too far from the marked trails report a strange, oppressive silence in that part of the mountains, a coldness that lingers even on the hottest summer days. Some claim to smell the faint, phantom scent of cornmeal on the air. Others have reported seeing a woman in a dark dress, standing among the trees, watching them with cold, dead eyes, only to vanish when they look again. The mass grave is unmarked, lost to time, its occupants anonymous victims of a grief that turned homicidal. The cold case of Blackwater Ridge is in the official sense solved. But the why of it, the deep human darkness that motivated it, remains a subject of chilling speculation. It forces us to ask a disturbing question. What is the breaking point of a human soul? And what horrors are we capable of when that line is crossed? The file may be closed, but the haunting of Blackwater Ridge endures, a permanent stain on the historical record, a testament to a day when an entire town was consumed by a widow's forbidden, terrifying sorrow. The tale of Eliza Blackwood is a macabre journey into the heart of rural American Gothic. It's a narrative woven from isolation, cruelty, and a terrible, slow-burning revenge that escalated into a mass casualty event. The poison she used was arsenic, but the true venom was the years of silent abuse and ostracization. She was a cold case, suspect long before she committed her final, horrifying act, and the town that judged her had no idea they were writing their own death warrant with every whisper and scornful glance. The discovery of the infant's grave beneath her cabin floorboards transforms the story from a simple revenge plot into a far more disturbing, complex tragedy. It becomes a story of profound, warped grief. The cornbread, a symbol of Southern hospitality, was twisted into a weapon of mass destruction, a last supper for a town she had already condemned. Her final act, dressing in her wedding gown and taking her own life in the frozen, forbidden woods, was not an escape, but a final, grotesque tableau, a ritualistic exit from a world that had offered her nothing but pain. It's a horrifying story, but one that underscores the terrifying potential hidden behind the silent facades of the forgotten and the outcast. The poison that Eliza Blackwood baked into that cornbread was swift and devastating, but the poison that the town had fed her was slow-acting, distilled over years of cruelty and indifference. This story serves as one of the most disturbing examples of communal guilt in American folklore. The ledger she kept was a perfect, chilling mirror of the town's own soul. They saw their sins listed, and in that moment, they understood their part in the tragedy. The terror of Blackwater Ridge is not just that a woman could murder an entire town. It is that the town, through its own mundane, everyday malice, had provided her with the motive. They had treated her as subhuman, as a haint or a witch, and in the end she obliged them by becoming a monster far more terrible than their superstitions could have ever conjured. The vanishing act, the subsequent discovery of her frozen body, and the final heartbreaking reveal of the locket, each layer of this cold case is more macabre than the last. It's a story that refuses to provide easy answers. Was she a victim, a monster, or both? The lines are so blurred they cease to exist, leaving only the chilling, undeniable fact of the massacre. This story is a chilling reminder of how the cold cases of the past are never truly cold. They are buried just beneath the surface, like the infant's grave under Eliza's floor. The horrors of 1883 feel immediate and visceral because the emotions that drove them, grief, isolation, and rage, are timeless. The isolation of Blackwater Ridge acted as an incubator for Eliza's darkening mind, allowing her plans to grow undetected. What secrets are being incubated in the isolated corners of our world today? This particular story has been banned from local Virginia histories, deemed too dark, too shameful to be memorialized. But these are precisely the stories that must be told. If you agree, and if you want to continue to unearth the most disturbing and forbidden histories that have been deliberately buried, consider supporting the channel by subscribing. These dark narratives are a crucial part of our collective history, and they hold warnings that are still terrifyingly relevant. The more we suppress them, the more power they hold over us. The silence that Blackwater Ridge afforded Eliza was, after all, the most dangerous weapon of all. The legacy of the Cornbread widow is not just the ghost town she left behind, but the horrifying questions she forces us to confront. The discovery of her wedding dress and the ritualistic nature of her suicide in the Devil's Hollow suggests a mind that had completely detached from reality, operating on a plane of dark, symbolic logic. She wasn't just killing the townsfolk. She was, in her mind, purging the world that had wronged her, performing a dark baptism by arsenic. The wedding dress, a symbol of her failed hopes and the beginning of her abuse, became her funeral shroud. The final act was a wedding to death itself, a horrifying consummation of her grief. The fact that she sat upright, frozen, staring with open eyes suggests she wanted to be found. She wanted her macabre masterpiece to be seen. It was her final, silent testimony. The town had ignored her in life, but they would be forced to gaze upon her in death. It is a chilling, perfectly executed final statement from a woman who had lost everything and decided, in her madness, to take everything else with her. The most disturbing element of this case remains the ledger. The sheer, calculating patience it must have taken to catalog the sins of an entire community is almost incomprehensible. This was not a crime of passion. It was a premeditated, meticulously planned extermination. Eliza Blackwood had watched, listened, and recorded. She had weighed the town in the balance of her own broken mind and found it wanting. The cornbread was her instrument of judgment. This level of cold, systematic rage is profoundly unsettling. It challenges our understanding of the victim archetype. While she was undoubtedly a victim of her husband's cruelty and the town's scorn, her response was disproportionate to a horrifying, almost biblical degree. She answered their small cruelties with an absolute, apocalyptic cruelty of her own. This case file is a study in the horrifying mathematics of revenge, where 1,000 small cuts are repaid with a single, fatal blow delivered to an entire populace. The file on Blackwater Ridge may be closed, but the psychological questions it raises remain terrifyingly open, a cold case for the human soul. What truly vanished from Blackwater Ridge in 1883 was not just a town, but the illusion of safety. Eliza Blackwood's act was a profound violation of the most basic human trust. To take a community's offering, the potluck, the shared meal, and turn it into a weapon is an act of almost primal betrayal. It poisoned the very concept of community itself. The survivors who walked away from that town were not just fleeing ghosts, they were fleeing the horrifying knowledge of what their neighbors, and perhaps they themselves, were capable of. The curse of the widow was the paranoia she left behind. How could you ever trust anyone again? How could you ever share a meal without a flicker of doubt? The horror of the cornbread was that it was eaten willingly, even joyfully, by the very people it was designed to kill. It was a Trojan horse, delivered with a smile that unleashed hell from within. This is the enduring, macabre power of the story. The monster was not an outsider, but one of their own, a woman they had created and then fatally underestimated. The story of the Blackwater Ridge Massacre serves as a dark mirror to the mythology of the American frontier. We are often told tales of community, resilience, and pioneer spirit. But this story reveals the horrifying underbelly of that isolation. It shows a community that was not unified, but fractured, held together by a fragile, shared hypocrisy. Eliza Blackwood was the living embodiment of their buried sins, a cold case of domestic abuse and communal neglect that everyone knew about but refused to address. Her final, horrifying act was simply forcing that which was hidden into the light. The arsenic did not introduce a poison to the town. It merely made the existing poison visible, bringing the internal rot to the surface. The town did not die on the picnic green. It had been dying a slow death for years, in the silent complicity of its citizens. Eliza's cornbread was just the eulogy. This forbidden history is a testament to the fact that the most terrifying threats are often not the ones lurking in the dark woods, but the ones sitting silently at our own table. The final, lingering question is one of pure, macabre speculation. What happened in that cabin between Eliza, her brutal husband Silas, and the child whose hair she clutched in her dying moments? The discovery of the infant's grave opens a door to a horror that is almost too dark to contemplate. Was the child's death the true catalyst? Did Silas, in a drunken rage, commit an act so unforgivable that it severed Eliza's last tie to humanity? Did she kill her husband not for what he did to her, but for what he did to their child? And did the town, in its willful ignorance, become the accessory to that unspeakable act? The ledger of grievances, then, takes on an even more sinister meaning. The sins she listed were not just scornful looks. They were the sin of knowing, of hearing, and of doing nothing. The poisoning of the town was not just revenge. It was a cleansing, a horrifying, misanthropic correction. In her mind, she was simply balancing the scales, delivering the justice that God and her community had both denied her. The file on Eliza Blackwood is closed. The town of Blackwater Ridge is gone, reclaimed by the earth. But the story remains, a chilling piece of dark history, a cold case that lingers like a frost in the air. It is a macabre tale of how profound grief, when mixed with unbearable cruelty and total isolation, can curdle into a form of madness that is both terrifyingly destructive and chillingly methodical. The widow who baked poisoned cornbread did more than just kill her neighbors. She murdered a town, erased it from the map, and left behind a horrifying monument to her own suffering. Her frozen body, dressed in its wedding gown, sitting in the forbidden heart of the woods, is one of the most disturbing images in the annals of American crime. It serves as a permanent, frozen warning that the silent, the outcast, and the forgotten are the ones who watch the closest. And they are the ones who keep the most meticulous records,